There are a lot of things about homeschooling that have surprised me, and today I want to focus on some of the surprising benefits from homeschooling. I'm a college professor, and we have been homeschooling our kids since 2017. In this video, I'm going to talk about what my kids are getting from homeschooling that is going to benefit them for the rest of their lives, how homeschooling solved some problems that I never anticipated, and also I might have an existential crisis as I realize that a really important part of my life is built on a very thin foundation. You might notice that a lot of public school kids are like this girl that we saw at church. My wife is leading an activity for young girls at our church. It's probably some sort of craft. And she points out that, hey, we can calculate how much of the supplies we need through a simple multiplication problem. One girl protests and says, "I'm not going to do math." My wife, she tries to kind of help her along and says, "Well, you do math every day at school." And the girl gives this really telling response and says, "I'm not at school. I don't do math unless I'm at school." Sometimes we can confuse schooling and learning. And when that happens, when we make those things seem like they're the same, then learning becomes something that happens at another place, not at home, and it stays there. In fact, teachers are assigning less homework and parents are supporting this because they don't want to have that happening in the home. And I'll admit, I see why parents are protesting. I'll actually talk about that later on in this video as one of the other benefits. It plays into that. But what's happening then is that you get this completely separate world of learning and the home. This first surprising benefit of homeschooling is that my kids do not treat learning as something that happens in a different place. For them, learning is integrated into their lives. It's something that's just part of what we do. And I see that benefiting them for the rest of their lives because once you leave school, some kids stop learning. But my kids, they're not leaving school. They were never in school. They were always learning, and they will keep learning. In fact, the second surprising benefit of homeschooling is something that really cemented in me that my kids are going to be lifelong learners. And it really is demonstrated in a recent experience I had with my son. I'm walking by our homeschool space and I see that my son's working on an assignment. And so I decided to just poke my head in and see how things are going. He's working on math and he's really enjoyed the math course he's in. The videos are really helpful. The assignments are concise and they do what they're supposed to do. I mean, he usually does fine in the math, but when I see that he's working on math, I always like to just kind of check in, make sure that he's understanding everything and that I can help out in any way. So I ask how things are going and he's a teenager. So I get a one-word response, something like, "Good." And so I follow up, you got to follow up on these kind of things. And so I just ask so are you understanding everything in the videos? Do you need help with anything? And he replies, "Oh, I don't have videos anymore." And I'm like, "What do you mean you don't have videos anymore?" Well, it turns out the course that we got was on some sort of year-long plus a couple months to give you some forgiveness because they understand people don't finish everything. And our access to the course had ended. Now, the videos, now he still had the books and he was working through the assignments, but he didn't have the video instructions. So I was like, "How are you doing these things? What has been going on?" Clearly this has been weeks, if not months, since you haven't had those video lessons. And let's ignore the part that I'm a negligent father not checking in on my son more often, apparently. But he just replies once I lost access to the videos, I just started reading the book and doing the exercises and working through the example problems. I just figured out how to do it. Now, again, ignoring the fact that I'm a negligent father, let's focus on the awesome part that my son was a problem solver. That instead of just saying "Hey, this is not going to work out. I don't have access. I guess I can't do this." He said, "Well, what do I still have access to?" And he opened up the books and he did the problems. I was just really impressed that this kid decided, hey, if I don't understand it, I've just got to figure things out for myself. And again, a lot of kids see learning as receiving it from some sort of instructor or even a parent, right? And I was so impressed that my son saw learning as something that he could do himself. So the second surprising benefit is how much my children have learned that learning is something that they have control over themselves. They don't have to rely on a place or an instructor. Learning is something that happens within them. This leads into the third surprising benefit. This one actually should not have been as surprising. In fact, it's one of the reasons why people homeschool. But how it came to us and how it actually worked out surprised me because it totally passed our expectations. It deals with a kid that struggled with a subject, and maybe you can relate to this and have seen this in your own kids. But we have a daughter who we started to work on reading, and I actually think that I started her a little bit earlier than some of the other kids because we had already had a couple of older siblings, right? Like, we're ready to go through this. We know how this works. Let's just start reading. You're interested in it? Let's go. And I would sit with her and work on some of the phonics, and some of them were fine, and others just would not click. It was bizarre, maybe not bizarre, because again, we were starting earlier. And so we kind of just said maybe we're starting a little too early. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Let's let her take it at her own pace. And it still, as she grew up, it was a struggle for her. Now, without a doubt, if she was in the public school system, she would have been flagged as below reading level. And in the best case, that would have gotten her more resources, more help, and they would have helped plug that gap. But in the worst case, she would have looked at her peers, what they were doing, and she would have said, I guess I'm just not a good reader. She could have gotten discouraged, and she might have just identified herself for the rest of her life as someone who's not very good at reading. Instead, with homeschooling, two things happened. First, we noticed that she wasn't facing the same struggles with math. And so since she could do the math, we decided to keep pushing ahead, and she actually went above grade level in math. Second, instead of comparing herself to peers, she started maybe not comparing herself, but at least looking at her siblings. And she saw that her siblings loved to read, and she knew that that was something she wanted to do. And so we would go to the library, and her older siblings would get stacks of books. The librarians, they know us by name because we're showing up and regularly walking out with half the library. And she would see that and say, I know I can't read, but I want stacks of books too. And she would get her stacks of books. She would go home and she would look at the pictures. She would try her hardest and she would work at it. And over time, as she got older and was able to interpret the symbols better, she started reading and reading. She was never discouraged. In fact, she just saw as this challenge that she took head on. And she said, I am going to read. Today, she's probably at grade level, maybe a bit above grade level. My wife finished a book and she asked her, hey, can I read that book after you now? And it was an easier level book. But I'm just amazed at how much she loves to read now, considering when she started, it was such a struggle. I know that for many people, something that's attractive about homeschool is that it lets kids learn at their own pace. But I've always put that at the kid who was the smartest in the class, who was bored because the material wasn't progressing fast enough for them. They get put into homeschool and now they're graduating from college at age 14 or something. You've seen the stories. But what surprised me, this benefit that I find surprising, is that I didn't realize how good homeschooling would be for my kids who struggle. Okay, moving into this fourth one is a little strange, and I feel guilty saying this, but is it okay to say that one of the benefits of homeschooling is that my kids fight more? Let me explain what I mean. I am the oldest of 5 siblings, and of course we fight, right? I think it's just impossible to not have siblings who fight. But I look at my kids, and I think, I did not fight as much as my kids do. And maybe I'm just conveniently forgetting a lot of the fights, right? I can just have this bad memory that goes through and conveniently ignores all the times that we had fights, and I can just pretend I was this angelic child. And maybe I'm just undervaluing my parents. Maybe they were really good at teaching us how to cooperate and good virtues, and we just didn't fight as much. But then one day I thought about my typical day in high school. Now, I don't remember the exact schedule. I'm gonna rough this out, but I think the school day would start at 8 a.m. and we would get out at 3 p.m., right? So we have that big block in the middle of the day for school. Now, I was involved in athletics. I ran track. So I often had practice right after school for a few hours. If I didn't have practice, I was working at a movie theater, and so I would work at the movie theater after school sometimes, or I'd be going out and hanging out with friends a couple of times. In the evenings, maybe sometimes I had that work at that time, or again, hanging out with friends, going to church activities. Speaking of church, actually, when I was in high school, I would go to church before school for classes and then go straight from those classes to school. So actually those started at probably 6:30. I don't know the exact time, whatever, right? But like, as you look at this, my day is jam-packed with what I was doing between all of my high school activities. Once I looked at this, I realized that I was not forgetting fights. We really did not fight that much. I mean, look at this schedule. Where in this schedule would you have time to fight with your siblings? Most kids are spending the majority of their day in school. When I was in school, I didn't have a problem with that. I liked school. I had friends at school. I enjoyed spending time with them. But today I look at my life and I realize I'm not in contact with any of the people from high school, certainly not from elementary school. And maybe I'm different and weird. I know there are lots of people who retain tight relationships with their friends in high school, maybe a few of them, right? I'm not someone like that. My wife is also not someone like that. But you know who I do have tight relationships with? The people I do still talk to regularly? My family. Those siblings who I wasn't fighting with, right? I still retain contact with them, right? Because they're my family and we're texting each other, we're calling each other, we're going out and stuff. I talk to them way more than I talk to anyone else from high school. But then I look at my day and like those critical years when we were all in the same house, and I was spending the least amount of time with them. And this is what I meant at the very beginning when I said I might have an existential crisis, because I realized that like the most important relationships in my life are built on this really small sliver of time during those crucial years. So yes, the fourth surprising benefit is that my kids fight more. But it's not because they fight more that it's a benefit. It's because they talk to each other more. They serve each other more. And they're building more memories with each other that are going to be the foundation for their relationship for the rest of their lives. Earlier, I mentioned that some parents might be justified in pushing against homework and doing that work at home. That ties into this fifth and final surprising benefit of homeschooling. During the school year, my youngest kid's favorite part of the day is when the school bus comes by and picks up the neighborhood kids. I don't know why, but there's something about looking out that window, seeing that giant yellow bus. They just love it. They scream, they dance. They're just so excited for the bus to show up. I'm also excited for it, but that's because I know that by the time that those kids even get to school, my kids will have already made it through a whole subject. At the beginning of our homeschooling experience, I remember how concerned I was about how little time we were spending on the schooling part, the learning part with our kids, right? Their peers were going to school for 6.5 hours a day, and we were spending way less than that on their curriculum. But then I remembered my high school math classes, which usually began with a 10 to 15 minute lecture from the teacher, and then finished with 30, maybe 40 minutes of kids playing cards in the back of the class. That's why parents are getting so frustrated with homework. Their kids are spending 6.5 hours a day in school. How is there anything left to do? Well, the open secret about public school is that kids waste a ton of time. I think teachers wish it wasn't that way. I think teachers wish they could be spending more time on learning, more time on doing different things, but they also face so many constraints and resources, and their kids coming from totally different backgrounds and totally different home lives, and making sure that kids are actually learning and understanding and keeping at pace. But my homeschool kids, they don't have to worry about every other kid. That's not what dictates what they learn. They learn at their pace. They spend their time effectively, and then that opens up so much time for the rest of the day for them to do things that they're interested in. Now, some might say that all this time spent in school is not a waste. This is actually crucial time when kids are developing important social skills. But there are actually a lot of hidden costs to those social interactions. That's why you need to watch this video, so that way you can understand why socialization is the most overrated fear of homeschooling.